Yes, okay, thanks a lot, Silvia. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Simon Martin, who is kindly agreed to take part in the seminar. And Simon Martin teaches at Trinity College, Rome campus, and is a research fellow at the British School at Rome, where he carries out research on sport, fascism, and memory in Italy. His doctoral thesis on football and fascism in Mussolini's Italy was published in 2004 by Berg and won the British Society for Sports History Lord Aberdare Prize for Literary History. It was later published in Italian as Calcio e Fascismo by Oscar Mondadori in 2006. His second monograph, Sport Italia, The Italian Love Affair with Sport, 2010, also won the Lord Aberdare Prize. In 2019, he co-edited, together with Nick Carter, a very important special issue of Modern Italy, which was entitled Dealing with Difficult Heritage, Italy and the Material Legacies of Fascism. Dr. Martin is currently completing his third monograph, in which he's going to analyze the myth, memory, and meaning of the fascist martyr Giovanni Berta. And the book will be published later in 2022, this year. And indeed, today in the seminar, we are going to hear from this through his last project. And indeed, the title of his talk is Giovanni Berta, the Martyr, Mobilization and Memory of a Martyr. So Simon, please, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Guido. Thank you, Silvia. Thanks for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to share my screen because I've got some images that I want to use and show. So is that okay? Can you see that all right now? Yeah. Okay. So Giovanni Berta. I think the first thing I wanted to say about him really was to really talk about how I met him very briefly, but a little bit very briefly about how I met him and who he is, just before we start digging into the detail about him. I came across Berta, as Guido mentioned there, in my PhD research, which was on football and fascism. And here I looked at this was principally a comparison of the football clubs and their stadiums, the architecture of the stadiums of Florence and Bologna. And the Florentine stadium, as I came to discover, I was very, very green to all this. I had no idea of what I was looking at all, but the stadium was named the Stadio Giovanni Berta. So I was kind of, quite sensibly, I actually looked at the name and just, had to find out who this person was. And it turned out that he was a fascist martyr, and a fascist martyr who had been apparently brutally killed by communists. So I kind of repeated this story in that book in a very uncritical manner. So I took the story as I'd read it basically in fascist publications. And there was about a page of that in the book on football and fascism, but the story kind of stuck with me. It's a very brutal story, and it remained in my mind. And this, I guess this came to light again a few years later when I came to Rome. When I came to Rome and I started coming across these drain covers with his name upon them, from the Fonderia Giovanni Berta, and the one in the middle here, most striking of all, with the fascio littorio, with the symbol with the fascists, the symbol of the fascist regime, or the governatorato, the communal administration of Rome at the time. So this is what really kind of got me going on this project. It started with a question really. Well, what were all these drain covers doing in Rome? That led me to think about writing I was planning on writing an article. That article became a slightly bigger book maybe, and then it's become quite an even bigger book at the moment, which as Guido said, I'm going to be finishing hopefully very soon, and should be out by the end of this year. Now, Giovanni Berta himself, who was he? He was born in 1896. He was the son of a small iron foundry owner in Florence. His father, who will later on go on to become a deputy, a member of parliament. At age 18, Giovanni Berta apparently joined the Navy as an apprentice gunner for a term of 6 years. He fought in the Adriatic campaign of 1915 to 1918 in the First World War. I say apparently because only recently I finally found a route into to speak to somebody within the Italian naval archive, and we can find absolutely no record of his military service record. So I don't know. This is cited almost everywhere, and I would be very hesitant to disbelieve this actually. So I think he probably did, but I can find no evidence of that. He was demobilized in 1919, and he returned to work in the office of his father's iron foundry, the Fonderia Lecure, so in the district of Lecure, just on the periphery, just outside the center of Florence. Giovanni Berta died on the evening of the 28th of February 1921, and the facts surrounding his death have never been conclusively ascertained. And this was, in many ways, one of the things that I hope to get a little bit more clarity about in this project, but which has proved really quite difficult to do. What we can say is that Florence was certainly in a state akin to civil war. On the day prior to Berta's death, a bomb had been thrown into a patriotic parade in the Piazza degli Antinori in the center of Florence. This had resulted in the death of a Carabinieri officer, Antonio Petrucci, and a nationalist student, Carlo Menaboni, who was fatally injured, who died about 15 days later. That evening, in reprisal for this attack, fascists brutally murdered the communist syndicalist and editor of the Azione Comunista newspaper, Spartaco Lavagnini. He was executed with 4 or 5 bullets in the head. And as the story was told, he was replaced back in his seat and a cigarette placed in his mouth. So apparently when he was found, there was a sort of child cigarette left in his mouth, which is kind of indicative of the extreme violence and brutality that was certainly happening in Florence at the time. So the following day, after these deaths, after this violence, Florence was in a state, as I said, of almost of civil war, an extremely violent day. And on the evening of that day, the 26-year-old Giovanni Berta drowned in the river Arno beneath the Ponte Sospeso. He was almost immediately declared a martyr. And whilst we can say that he was almost certainly attacked, I think it's feasible that there was no intent to kill him. Whether he expressed any wish to die for the cause, whether he was a martyr and whether he was even a fascist, is equally difficult to affirm. So trying to unpick this story and the significance of his life and death was an aspect of what I was trying to do. And I think it was very important in doing this was to try to avoid his glorification or to avoid equally his demonization. And that's been one of the key kind of methodological studies of the methodological bases of this study, really trying to keep a kind of neutral perspective on this. When I first started, I was talking one evening in Rome to non-academics actually about what I was doing a few years ago. And a few people were quite horrified by the fact that I was sort of looking at this. And some people even said, well, you know, he deserved to die. He was a fascist. He should have died. And you know, that in itself was a kind of an interesting discussion for me in the way in thinking about his memory today. But as I say, the idea, what I was trying to do was keep a sense of neutrality about his image. Now, trying to maintain this neutrality has been really important when thinking about the various sources that are available. So I've had to use, obviously, a lot of fascist sources. This is where the bulk of material exists about Giovanni Berta. These sources that preserved and appropriated his memory and that of the apparent act. So there were exhibitions, toponomastic commemorations, various sculptures, the drain covers, the football stadium. There was a town named after him in Libya. Plus there was his very high profile and symbolic burial in the crypt of the fascist fallen, the fallen for the Fascist Revolution, which was beneath the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence, which was opened in 1934, which I'm going to come back to later on. Now, after Berta's death, a number of myths quickly emerge around his story. The first of these is that his attackers were communist. His attackers are almost certainly to have come from the very working class district of San Frediano, where there was the big iron foundry of Florence, the Pignone iron foundry. So it's quite likely they came from the working class. We don't know of their communist affiliation. And there is no sense of a political motive, and especially a political motive to this. And again, I will come back to this. The second myth to emerge around the story is perhaps the most important one, which is really evidenced in the images at the bottom here, and that's the myth surrounding his hands. The idea that his attackers, as Berta was hanging from the bridge, that they severed his hands, they chopped his hands off. This was the really brutal aspect of the story, something that, again, that I quite uncritically repeated in my first book, because this was how it appeared. Having got a copy of the autopsy, it's fake news. His hands are intact, they're barely scratched. The third myth to emerge from this was the way that he is frequently presented as a fascist martyr. This is never questioned, and it's never proven by fascist sources. He just is. He's not the first fascist to die in the city, and so he's not the obvious case necessarily to have been venerated as fascism's #1 martyr either. So these were kind of interesting stories as well. And that brings us to the fourth idea, the fourth kind of myth, which is about his fascist affiliation. It's impossible to prove. There are some people who go on to become quite leading fascists in the Florentine Fascist Party, the likes of Amerigo Dumini, who is later involved in the murder of Matteotti, and there are lists of the local members of the local party, and we can see their names. Berta's name doesn't appear on any of these lists, however reliable or unreliable they were. He just simply doesn't appear. So it's very difficult to prove that. But in practice, I think his membership with the fascist party, his fascist sympathies, or otherwise, they're impossible to confirm, but in many ways, they're almost not the real key part of the story. The key part of the story is the myth that's created around him and his alleged murder by communists, and that's what I want to now turn to. So what I want to do from this point, well, for the next part, what I'm going to talk about is I want to look at to examine the presentation and the mass communication of his death through 4 contemporary representations of his martyrdom. And then, having done that, I want to look at the last part, at his reburial within the crypt of Santa Croce, in the crypt beneath Santa Croce in Florence. So if I turn to the first of these images here, I think there are 2 really important points about this image that give it power. The first is is his age, and I think the emphasis that is placed upon its age. This is an adolescent. I would place him as maybe around 16 years old in this image. Berta himself was 26. He was a 26-year-old war veteran. So this boy, adolescent, young man, is quite clearly much younger than Berta. We look at the people above him who once again are stamping on his hands, beating him. The character in the middle has this particularly kind of horrific look on his face. So I think what this image is doing, first of all, it's drawing upon his childlike innocence, thereby exaggerating the barbarity of the act, exaggerating the barbarity of his fascist opponents. And this in many ways kind of connects with a long-standing kind of stereotype, the accusation, the idea that the communists eat children, comunisti mangiano I bambini, this kind of animalistic, cannibalistic association with the enemy. And this is something which comes up time and time again. Now, at the bottom of the image is beneath this statement, this warning, Italians remember. This is the first verse of a very well-known song that was initially sung by communists. Hanno ammazzato Giovanni Berta, they killed Giovanni Berta. Now, as you can see from this slide here, that shows the reverse of this postcard, this is actually from Fascist Party electoral propaganda from 1924. So what it's doing is drawing attention actually to the communist celebration of those who committed this apparent barbaric act of severing his hands. It's drawing attention to the fact that the communists celebrated this. They say, you know, long live the person who cut his hands off. So by doing this, it is reminding the electorate of the adversary's barbarity. Now, it wasn't only communists who sang this song. Fascist squads also sang. They sang very audibly to augment the threat of the enemy, to signal their presence, to give them courage often when they're going into action, to develop a sense of legitimacy in many ways about the action they're about to conduct. So vendetta is at the core of a lot of fascist songs, and they are particularly at the core of fascist songs and poems about Berta. And within the key of these, what they promise is always vendetta. It's always a settling of scores. So it's always a settling of scores so that Giovanni Berta can sleep well. There is this expression, dormi bene Berta. These are headlines of the newspapers, that in the sense that he's restless. Until this debt has been repaid, he can't rest in peace. So by maximizing the barbarity of his opponents, these opponents who had apparently severed his hands, the fascist repetition of the song becomes crucial to the demonization of their anti-fascist opponents, and at the same time to the legitimization of the squadrista response to this apparent brutality of the communists. Now, if I turn to the second image, this was published in 1935 within a small booklet for the fallen for the national cause, the Caduti per la Causa Nazionale. So it's a small pamphlet that contains one image and a page of text about fascist martyrs from Bologna, Milan, Padua, Genoa, Torino, and naturally Florence was represented by Giovanni Berta. Now, this image, I think, is slightly, in some ways, the power of this image is perhaps rooted in its portrayal of the true facts, its apparent authenticity. The bridge looks very similar. One of the things about the bridge, again, which we can see up here, is it is always presented with this kind of this cross shape on the parapet, which I'll come back to again later on. If we look at the image of Berta here in this image, he's presented as a male in his late 1920s. He's wearing a brown suit, which he was apparently wearing when he was dragged out of the river. On this occasion, he's got an overcoat and a scarf. His persecutors, once again, loom quite aggressively above. They're brandishing knives and long metal spike. They are roughly dressed when compared to Berta, so a contrast perhaps in their social class. So what these images is doing, once again, as all of these images do, they capture the moment of his martyrdom, the moment that Berta desperately hangs onto the bridge as the blows apparently rain down upon his hands. Now, a constant trope throughout the fascist text was the presentation of anti-fascists, not only as barbarous, but also as unnatural, as against nature, as I mentioned earlier, also sometimes even cannibalistic. So by default, this squadrista violence is thus legitimized as a defense against the threat posed by communism, which was a barbarian adversary, an adversary not only to fascism, but to humanity, to nature, to historical, cultural tradition within the city of Florence. And this is then contrasted with the apparent cleansing, the reinvigorating activities of the squads, the squads that were intent on regenerating Italy. So it contributes to creating and supporting the idea that fascist violence had returned the city to health, or was restoring the city to health, was restoring the natural order that had been disrupted by the Communist Party. So despite working hard, however, to maximize the apparent fascist threat. So on the one hand, the fascists worked very, very hard in the newspapers, in their reports, to maximize the threat which was posed by communists. On the other hand, there was often a lot of attention was drawn on their apparent cowardliness as well. And I think we could see this also in these images. It's indicated quite clearly by the outnumbering of Berta and by the use of weapons. So the hatred of the adversary, the fascist hatred of communists, wasn't simply ideological, but it was also based upon a perceived lack of heroism and a lack of an ability to fight. And this was again contrasted with the very brave and the patriotic squadrista. So the presentation of Berta's image, of his murder in these images, offers a very high profile opportunity to spotlight the barbarous, cowardly, and thus anti-national characteristics of fascism's socialist adversary. And it wasn't only socialist men who were demonized, it was socialist women too. They were also often portrayed as savage, animalistic, barbarous, dehumanized, diabolic, and they were cannibals even. There were reports in the famous defeat in many ways of fascism at Sarzana that women had boiled up a fascist or a police officer. They'd cooked his head and was serving up soup out to people passing in the streets. So this is all part of a construction of again of an animalistic, cannibalistic image. And as part of this image about women, I think what this does is also presents them as having no sense of what it was to be a mother. They were inhuman, so they didn't know what it was to be a mother, because no real mother could have possibly participated in this sort of violence that caused so much pain to fellow mothers through the murder of their sons. And that links me to the third image that I want to show, this one here. And as we can see on the back, starting with the back of the postcard on this occasion, this was dedicated to the old and glorious squadrismo and to the young fascist followers and the custodians of the bloodstained traditions. So if we look above that, at the top of the postcard, what we can also see is a repetition of the first line from that key song, again underlining his barbaric murder. Now, the final words of all martyrs provide the climax. They are the most memorable part of the act. They're really the very important moment that we have to remember. They might be humorous, they could be defiant, they could be inspiring. Now, in Berta's case, it was this cry to his mother, as is seen at the bottom of the postcard here. And it's very unusual for any account of Berta's death not to refer to this cry to his mother at this very critical moment. So, and it's far more than just a rhetorical detail that was intended to draw empathy. It's almost in every report, every image, it's constantly repeated over and over and over and over again, this theme that he cries to his mother. So naturally, I had to look at this. And if we think about fascism's relationship with women, quite simplistically, fascism wanted to return women to the home. It wanted to restore patriarchal authority. It wanted to confine women to childbearing and child-raising roles. So while women would not occupy key, very high-profile roles within the movement and the party, they were nonetheless still very important mobilizers. So female heroism was consequently expressed and conducted principally through motherhood. And in this, through this example, what we can see is that the mother's grief is now directed and given some sense. So the message is quite clear that you have to be strong because your son, your squadrista son who may have died, his death has not been in vain. So consequently, what mothers become they become virtuous examples. They become virtuous examples by tolerating and suffering this heroic sacrifice. They suffer this in the name of the patria, in the name of the motherland. So death, in fact, or the death of their sons is a part of their mission. So the emphasis on Berta's mother here spotlights the expectation of the squadrista mother to stoically bear the burden of her son's, the risk that her son is taking, the risks associated with her son's faith in fascism. And in supporting that, in bearing that burden, she naturally makes her very important contribution to the revolution. This is what effectively frees, liberates future men to go and effectively risk or give their lives for the fascist revolution. So what this does is it nationalizes the act. It nationalizes Berta's murder, which is transformed from one that was no longer one that was just against him as an individual, but it's one that's against fascism. It's one that is against the patria. It's one that is against Italy. It is against the female figure of l'Italia, the Mater Dolorosa. And in many ways, the Virgin Mary is the prime example for fascist mothers to follow. Strong, stoic, able to withstand the most acute pain in the face of the most terrible loss. So suffering and enduring in the name of the patria, the support and the courage of the fascist mother was consequently essential if her activist son was to risk his life guilt-free. And there are lots of reports in some of the diaries of squadristas, Banchelli, who comes to Bruno Frullini, these come to mind immediately. That lots of their diaries, they talk about the pain of their mum, they talk about the condition of their mum, kind of when they come back from the raids and finding their mum awake at night, often with a fever because of what they've been suffering, about the fear of not knowing what may well have happened. And death was also a possibility for the squadristas. Now, connecting again to the idea of the mother, this final image, this, I think, extraordinarily striking image is Ezio Buscio's submission to the 1936 Biennale competition for syndicate members under the age of 35. It was a fresco, and driven by the domestic and the international context following the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, 1935, the war of 1935 to 1936, the 1936 Biennale becomes very, very deeply propagandistic. So whilst the artist on this occasion doesn't express Berta's final cry to his mother, his portrayal of Berta in this image is clearly as a sacrificed Christ. And this again references the Virgin Mary's grief, and thus consequently, thus all Italian mothers who had lost their sons who in their fight for the Fascist Revolution. So the Invocation of Christ was naturally the most important martyrological tradition. It required, thus for the martyr to be required in as Christly fashion as possible. So this is, in this image, this is quite clearly the source of the image's power. It remains very close to the Christian tradition. A Christian tradition with which naturally the Italian audience would have been very familiar. A consistent feature of the literature of the early church, suffering, persecution, and the death of an individual were understood in terms of the suffering of the Saviour. So this image interprets that, and it perhaps offers a different reading of it. It's a quite, as I said, striking image. It's an unmistakable image. He's on this occasion hanging from the bridge. We know it's the bridge because at the top corner here again we have the very consistent X part of the bridge parapet. Berta is very muscular. He's bare-chested, as Jesus often portrayed in crucifixion scenes. His feet are crossed, although he doesn't have stigmata. He has a kind of classical concave stomach. He's also covered by a type of loincloth, and we follow this. It looks initially as if this is just covering his modesty, but as we follow it from one side, it actually comes up behind his back. And what it does is, if you can look here, it covers over this arm here. So it gives the image that actually both of his hands have been severed. Quite clearly on this side, the suggestion that his hand has been severed. But on here, it's not. He's still hanging onto the bridge. But this cloth is actually giving that, creating that impression that both his hands have been severed. If we look at his gaze, he's obviously, well, he's looking up, perhaps to heaven. He's maybe also looking upward towards his assassin. He's looking up towards his assassin, maybe in a peaceful, it's almost an expression of pleasure, almost of relief, perhaps a job that has been achieved. So there's very little evidence of the unimaginable pain and shock that there would have been at having his hands removed. So this imitation of Christ is about the sanctification of Berta. It affirms his apparent courage, his inherent goodness, and it also shows the way to glory. Now, the painter and the critic, Cipriano Efisio Oppo, he reviewed this work by Ezio Buscio, and he also analyzed it at the time. And he further, in his review, he further sustained the principal myths that were associated with Berta's death. So in the bottom right, according to Buscio's analysis, were the three Furies from Greek mythology, the Furies who lived in the underworld and ascended to the earth to pursue the wicked. They were goddesses of vengeance and retribution. They meted out justice to unpunished criminals. They meted out justice against crimes committed against the natural order, exhibiting emotions of rage, horror, and fear. These young modern women in Buscia's frescoes here, they don't really conform to the classic image of the Furies. These are often portrayed as quite old hags, witch-like figures with snake hair. But there's a clear reference to this in the kind of snake-like hair of this woman here that really reinforces Oppo's connection. The Furies are often seen in three, and again, looking at this at a first glance, it seems they're only in two, but behind these two very modern, quite elegantly dressed women, we have this very kind of classical image of one of the Furies behind this crouched, older, more traditional hag-like figure. Now, prostrate upon the bridge above, again, which is very clearly denoted by this ex-parapet, is Berta's demonic, bestial, knife-wielding assassin. He's caught in the act. He is the devil incarnate. At the bottom right here, with this kind of quite a calm quite a calm pose in many ways, we have a fascist. We can tell he's a fascist because he has the skull here as the symbol of the arditi, so an ardito belt buckle. Here he seems to be quite clearly exacting revenge upon a very similarly demonic figure down at the bottom right here. So going beyond the more direct and customary traditional image of the fascist martyr, Berta's crucifixion by demonic socialists represented an attack that wasn't just upon fascism once again, but not just upon the nation, but now it was an attack upon the entire Christian or Italian Christian Catholic community. So it fuses the body of the fascist, or the heroic fascist, the heroic martyr Berta, with that of Christ, with that of the nation, and with that also of the church. So his sacrificed body in this case is empowered to then therefore reunite the nation around Catholicism and regenerate the nation. It redeems the sins of socialism. And in turn, it brings the god of the kingdom of fascism, Mussolini, down to earth. So by directly comparing this image, directly comparing this image with that of Jesus, this provides a model of endurance, stoicism in the face of perceived consistent hostility and aggression from socialists. It once again further justifies the very strong fascist response, and it warns of the need to be in a permanent state of readiness to fight for fascism against the opponent who is always there. And this is a really important thing about fascism. It never actually it never proclaims the defeat of socialism. The socialist threat is always there, and it's left there deliberately as a mobilizing force. Now, like religious saints, fascist martyrs were engaged posthumously in the cause for which they had fallen. They were valuable as a sacrifice, as an example, or a victory. Martyrs were awarded a privileged afterlife that raised them above that of the ordinary dead. They were transformed into symbols of the revolution and a newfound love of the motherland. So their deaths were, in the process, they were nationalized, and the fallen soldier, or the squadrista, was therefore worked into or reworked into a national celebratory cult. So as with Christian martyrdom, which used easily accessible churches and religious buildings to promote the cult, fascism applied a similar rationale to the celebration of its own dead. So martyr cults and crypts thus offered a defined locus, a defined place where active remembering could take place, where narratives and recollections could be shared, transformed, transmitted. The fascist dead were always said to be ever presente. They were always there. They would live on through their comrades and the coming future generations. So as the unofficial pantheon for the heroes of Italian culture, a crypt beneath the Basilica of Santa Croce was selected to honor and host the Florentine fallen. Santa Croce holds the mortal remains of patriotic heroes like Machiavelli, Galileo, Michelangelo, Ugo Foscoli, to name but a few. So by burying its own dead within the crypt below, fascism was trying to develop a link and a shared spirit between its own 37 martyrs within the city, who had apparently been sacrificed in the name of Italy, and those who had fallen or given their lives for the formation of Italy, for the Risorgimento. The inauguration of the Sacrario dei Caduti per la Rivoluzione Fascista took place in Florence on the 27th of October 1934, and this was one of the key moments in the development of fascism's cult of the martyrs. It was essentially a local commemoration, but it was also turned into an exercise in national mass participation in the creation of unity and identity around fascism, its fallen, and the motherland. The coffins holding the exhumed remains of the fascist fallen, these were laid overnight in the Duomo in Florence. A mass was held the following morning before each was carried in 7 stages by groups of 6 former squadristi. So we've got 37 coffins held by 6 squadristi, and these squadristi changed 7 times. So there's almost around 1,000 squadristas who are involved in this process. It's a very circuitous route. It's not a direct route from the Duomo to Santa Croce. It takes a very wide, broad route around the city. And as the Corriere della Sera described at the time, the march was conducted in religious silence, a religious silence that was broken only by old songs of the revolution and the fanfare of the band that set the slow rhythm of the march. The route, as you can see in this image, was lined throughout with black canvases at 10-meter intervals, each of them bearing the name of one of the fallen. The city was also plastered with posters bearing a message from the Podestà, from the fascist mayor at the time, celebrating the sacrifice of these 37 individuals. Arriving into a packed Santa Croce, the Piazza of Santa Croce, Mussolini was there at the ceremony. He made a speech before the party secretary, Achille Starace, announced the name of each of the fascist fallen in the classic fascist roll call. This was broadcast to radio listeners throughout Italy. There were loudspeakers placed in piazzas in Rome, within Milan. So this became a national event in this way. The individuals, the coffins were carried individually into the crypt, where the martyrs were blessed by the Archbishop of Florence. Each was then placed into their own sarcophagus within the presence of Mussolini, who gave them one final Roman salute. Now, on entering the crypt from the Via dei Malcontenti, or as it was at the time, the Via 28 Ottobre, in this small arch on the left, you can see there was a sculpture of the dead Christ, or the Pietà. This had originally been planned for the altar, but it proved impractical there. But we get this very obviously very Christian, very striking martyr image as we enter the crypt. From that point, visitors then faced the vaulted corridor that we can just see through the doorway here. And there were 2 long corridors separated by a central room with an altar. Halfway along, there was an altar. This is just, you can just sort of see this on the left-hand side. This is the central area of the crypt. There was a small altar. This had a marble slab set into the wall on the side with 3 fasces. So again, you can just see the fascia of the 3 fasce d'Ittorio on that side of the image there. These have been taken from an ancient Roman bas-relief from the Campidoglio in the centre of Rome. The sarcophagi run the length of the corridor. So there was some from the corridor this end and the corridor carrying on further down to the bottom end here. I'll show you a map of this now. Running along the wall above the sarcophagi was this constant repeated message once again of presente. So the crypt was arranged with 22 sarcophagi along, here's the long corridors, 22 sarcophagi along the central corridor, 11 per wing, a further 11 in the central chapel here, and then 4 in front of the altar. And naturally here at the front right was the positioning of Berta, so in the principal position of the fallen. So the quasi-religious nature of this ceremony, what was this about? Well, this was certainly about fascism comparing its faith to that of Christianity. It links with the idea of fascism as a secular religion. It created a link between the living, the dead, and immortality. It also presented dying for the fascist cause as an honourable, worthwhile, and a potentially more rewarding event than life itself, whilst it also underlined how martyrs were examples for everybody to follow. So recalling the roots of fascism and the spirit of the first hour, thereafter the regime periodically turned to its martyrs whenever it was in need. So the recall of the fascist martyrs of the first hour and Giovanni Berta is something that happens throughout the rest of the fascist regime. Now, to try and pull this together, as I said, martyrs were really important. They're very, very important for the fascist movement for a number of reasons. And Berta, who is celebrated as the #1 martyr, was absolutely crucial. Press reports at the time and the literary accounts of his life and death, they very much set the story. And they also build upon what for me has been really quite shocking, quite stunning in many ways, the almost normalized linguistic violence of the press at the time. The language of the press in 1920, 1921, the violence of that, the brutality of that is really, it really is quite shocking. Visual images and material culture were absolutely essential to the long-term propagation and the dissemination of messages surrounding fascist martyrs. They transmitted the power and the trauma of these events. And among these, Berta's representation was absolutely critical. It was critical in its ability to draw attention to the anti-fascist barbarity. It was critical in creating the impression of fascism's oppression, its apparent oppression, and consequently the legitimacy of its response. Berta's death displayed the courage and the commitment of the fascists of the first hour, those who would be called upon, as I mentioned, throughout the following years of fascist rule. They showed the stoicism, the faith of the fascist martyrs, their ideology, their faith in their God, in their leader. So thereafter, the memory and the constant repetition of the memory of these martyrs maintained Italian society in a high state of alert. It maintained a high state of fear on both sides of the political divide. It mobilized individuals into action, or at worst, it ensured their benevolent neutrality. So these were very highly important in terms of mobilizing support. And the case of Berta was very specific in its attempted mobilization of mothers, in its gendering of grief. Women were supposed to accept their grief stoically. Men were expected to go out and seek revenge. So mixing this new martyrdom cult with established devotional images and practices gave fresh meaning and significance to well-known, recognized religious traditions. These traditions that were deeply ingrained within Italian society. So there was the potential here to engage both the fascist and the Catholic audiences. Identifying with the patria, with the motherland, martyr representations constructed an image that excluded the adversary, the socialists, from the nation. They couldn't be martyrs. And so consequently, this turned fascist victims into national martyrs. So as a key part of fascism's cult of the dead and fascist martyrs, the myth of Giovanni Berta was used at the time to contribute very importantly to the destabilization and the overthrowing of the state. And throughout the years of the regime, right through into the Second World War, to serve fascism's attempt to manufacture consent and ensure the longevity of its rule. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Simon, yes, for this extremely fascinating and compelling presentation. I think you can stop the sharing of your screen, so we can create more, exactly, yes. We have a view that represents more the kind of debate and conversation we're going to have now. So I want to thank you, first of all, because even just the PowerPoint, with all the extremely fascinating pictures you showed, I think that material culture is so useful to have a sense, of the construction of fascist propaganda and fascist myths. and also you took a very complex task in trying, to telling what was real in all this propaganda and what was not, and that's very, very hard, I mean, for everyone that works on the past and on stories that have been repeated and retold so many times. So I have several questions actually to ask. Some are more specific and some more general. I think so we start with one, which is the more general one, and then we'll see if others would like to come in and ask questions. And of course, for the audience, you can ask questions either in person by raising your hand, or please use the chat if you don't want to speak on screen. But so the most general question that I want to ask you actually refers to the small episode that you said. I think it was extremely telling about other scholars that you met that were, you said the word horrified, by this kind of research project. And of course, I'm not going to ask you who were the people that had this opinion, but I would like to hear, your reflection on what, as you said, this is also an interesting take as a reaction of, today's historians to people that are in case that believe, in the importance of studying the past. So what does it tell, still about Italian culture? And in a way, I mean, if you could reply to that and say briefly in your words, why instead studying something like this matters and matters even today, I mean.
Okay, I should clarify a point, which perhaps I didn't clarify properly enough. Some of the people who were horrified, I mentioned that, they weren't historians. Okay. So but in some ways that's also interesting. I mean, I kind of drew that, I just dropped that in. That was a kind of ad hoc confession, but thinking about it, it is an interesting point, because I was just at dinner one evening and I was talking about it, and there are a number of people said to me, well, exactly, why would you want to study this? And well, he was a fascist, he deserved to die. So I think the reflection of that is that I think it's a reflection of post-war Italy, which is very binary, which is why I said this very, very important point about the work I'm trying to do is, and I do very much try to take my students, I try to talk a lot with the students about this, is about the idea of kind of antagonistic memory. So this binary memory. So we're kind of about creating in and out groups, us and them groups. It's very unhelpful. There are different, lots of different, there are many aspects to Italian post-war history, the history of the war itself, the history of fascism that have and haven't been talked about. Something I was talking with students literally about yesterday, and we were talking about the kind of the purges in the immediate after post-war period, of sort of from May, June, July 1945. So let's say partisan, even communist guilt violence, it happened. Communist violence was happening in 1921, 1920 in the rise. So the idea is, the idea that all fascists were bad is well, perhaps I shouldn't put it that all fascists were bad, but the idea that fascists were only responsible for the bad things, let's put it that way, is something that we have to kind of get over. And I think it's something about, I do think it's really important. It's very difficult. How we do that is another debate. I've had this discussion with many people. I've taken students in the past we go to Predapio. I take them to the Casa della Memoria, which is Mussolini's house just outside Predapio, which has been maintained as a shrine to Mussolini. And it's a very, very difficult trip to take. And we go and talk to these people, and they give us a tour around the house, and they give us their perspective. And then afterwards, we have to try and deconstruct that a little bit. And I'm not totally sure. I've done it a few times, and I'm not sure what we get out of that, but I am sure that it would be wrong for me to ignore that. So if I take my students to Predapio, it would be wrong for me to ignore that there are people who have a very, very different view to what we have. So I think we should go and talk. We need to go and talk to people. We need to. I don't quite know how we go about doing that. But I do think that the idea that because fascists were all bad, then they shouldn't be studied is quite clearly nonsense, because it is important in our understanding of exactly what goes on, because the story about Giovanni Berta is not just about the violence against him, it's about the violence within society as a whole. In terms of historians, what I would say about this, about the Berta story with historians, is the thing that really surprised me is that there was just so little research upon this. There's almost nothing. It gets mentioned here and there. People drop in and mention Berta, and if you pick up books and go through the index, you'll often see a reference to Berta, but no one's really ever dug at this. And it's such an incredibly important story in terms of fascist martyrdom, but also in terms of the rise of fascism as a whole. He is the martyr. So it's quite extraordinary that nobody's really done that, and I don't quite know why that is. Why does it matter? I think I've probably sort of answered that in many ways. I mean, I do think it's important. I do think it's important that we look at history from all sides. And for a long time, our understanding and the writing of Italian history tended to be written from certain perspectives in the post-war period, and that certainly doesn't help. It doesn't help perhaps moving on from the war. It doesn't help moving on from fascism. It doesn't help dealing with the past. I don't think we can, I think people tend to like the idea, to talk about that we need to deal with the past, but I think we're going to deal with the past, and we do need to talk about it. And that's from both sides. So we can be very critical, perhaps, about the Mussolini obelisk, which stands outside the Foro Italico with absolutely no context there. But at the same time, we also have to talk about violence which was committed against fascists. I don't think we can separate the two.
Yes, thanks. It's a great answer. And as you said, I think is the first step. I mean, is of course to do research and to try to understand what happened, and to develop more complex stakes and more complex conversations. I agree. So, and I'm also relieved, to hear that those that were horrified were not actually historians in the end. So I see a hand from Silvia. So Silvia, please, if you would like to ask your question.
Yes, I'm happy to ask a question, but I don't want to monopolize the floor if someone else wants to come in. But I'll go for it.
For now,
Thanks so much,
yes.
Simon. Yeah, that was really, really riveting. I have a couple questions, I guess. One is the aftermath of this crypt in Santa Croce. What has happened to that? Do you know? Because I was never aware of it, and so that's really interesting. And my second question is about the afterlife of Berta instead in literature, and Guido's nodding because we've briefly exchanged just are noticing that, of course, Pratolini uses the figure of Berta in Lo Scialo. So have you looked also at the more, let's say, left-leaning reworkings of this figure of Berta at all? Has that shed any light on your project, or have you kind of delimited the chronology or the scope?
The afterlife, the afterlife and the aftermath that's the sort of the last chapter of the book. I think it's absolutely fundamental. That's the key. I came into what we're talking about today, and I came into the project by these drain covers that I'm walking over in Rome, and there are many in Rome, so it couldn't not think about the afterlife. So I think if I turn to the literature first of all. I do. I looked at Lo Scialo. In many ways, I just tried to find as many sort of literary references that there were to him. Not a huge amount, and generally, not surprisingly, his image is kind of invoked by the neo-fascist right. So it's from the research that I've been able to do. So it's obviously, I think it's fairly, I've spent a lot of time on this, but it's not exhaustive, and I'm very open to other, if anybody knows otherwise, but I haven't seen, there's not a great deal, obviously, in the immediate post-war period. In the 1960s, I think the Il Secolo runs a series of articles highlighting the demonization or demonizing communism basically in the 1920s, and Berta's it's quite strange because I think they have about a dozen articles, so it runs for about 10 or 12 weeks, And Berta is the symbol of this series. So when they announce it, we're going to be looking at this. There's going to be 10 or 12 articles looking at. So they look at the First World War. So the trope of the communists and the betrayal of the nation, the First World War, right through to into the fascist period. They announced this series by using Berta. He is coming up to today. He is he's invoked. Let's not over exaggerate it, but he's invoked amongst neo-fascist blogs quite a lot. He was, his name come up. There is a case of a neo-fascist who dies in Rome in the early mid-1970s, and now his name is now escaping me. Who has a commemoration in Piazza Tuscolo, who also falls from a balcony, having apparently been chased by communists. So there's a lot of, they kind of say that this was happening to Giovanni Berta in 1971, and 50 years later, it's still happening. They're still chasing us. They're still attacking us. So it comes up in these sort of contexts. And it's also named, it comes up again in Scoratti's book, in M. So Scoratti talks about this again, but only kind of giving it a couple of pages. He is a little bit more critical of the story than sort of analytical of in terms of the story than other accounts. But again, it's still kind of repeating a lot of the tropes, and that's not really surprising, because the story really hasn't been looked at. In terms of the Crypt is very interesting, and it's cost me a lot of time trying to get to the bottom of this, and I still haven't. I'm still looking for I still want some dates. The problem with the Crypt is that it's the archive of the Crypt is run by the monks of the monastery. Getting access to that archive, I've not been able to get access to the archive, so I've had the archivist there. I have to write to him with very specific dates, and he has scanned me copies of that page. And I'm still hoping that there's one. I think I've kind of found the date when it was cleared out. So what happens is that there is an epurazione immediately after the war. So it's such a big event, it just can't possibly stay. So Berta's sort of posthumous story is that he's first buried in San Miniato initially. He is then exhumed and taken in 1934 down to Santa Croce, and certainly by 1947, all of the bodies have been. I think if I remember rightly, it might even be a little bit earlier than that. The bodies have all been removed. The crypt is completely. The sarcophagi are broken up. There's a marble worker who sort of buys them for a small amount of money just to rework the marble. The crypt is completely restructured. So I've been back in there a couple of times. So if you go to Santa Croce, just to the right of the basilica, there's an entry into the convent effectively, and that takes you in. So there's the First World War memorial. There's the chapel there, which was a fascist built chapel. So that's okay, because that was dedicated to the First World War fallen and the military. So I get that, I understand that. It's quite evidently fascist in its style. When you enter there, you turn left, and then you enter into the long corridors where the crypt was. At the bottom of those corridors, there were three kind of plaques dedicated to the fallen in the Abyssinian War, in the Spanish Civil War, and also I think in the Second World War. Could be there's a third plaque. Anyway, these have remained. So once again, and there's a communal there's archival evidence for this. So there's the commune discuss leaving these plaques there, and they are considered to be okay because they were they were of the military. Now they were obviously of the military fighting a colonial war under the banner of fascism. So they're all still there. The entry was also for Hitler's visit in 1938. So that entry that I showed you from that photo was on the Via de Malcontenti. So now when you go to there, the crypt entry is actually on the side of that building. So just by the lodge on the side of Santa Croce, because they move it and restructure it all for Hitler's visit in 1938. The crypt itself, you can't visit. So I've been in there by writing to people and asking them to take me in. Last time I was there about 6 months ago, they said that there were plans to open it up. But in many ways, I'm not quite sure why they would want to open it up, because there's nothing there. And equally, there's nothing. There is a small kind of board which talks about the history of the crypt, and there's a little bit of a mention in it. They do actually mention that there was a fascist crypt, but it's kind of in the small print. But even the guardians, the staff who took me down in there, when I was talking to them about why I wanted to be there, none of them knew that this had actually existed. It's quite actually one thing I wanted to say about them, what there's a comparison also to make, which is quite interesting, and I don't know whether it, well, I can't really offer too much of an explanation about it, but there are, if we look at some of the principal fascist crypts as well, we've got that in Florence, which is completely restructured. The one in Rome, in Verano, which is still there, and but the bodies were exhumed, but that has become a neo-fascist pilgrimage site. So that's kind of still very active as a site of memory. And in Bologna, there was one in Bologna, and that's kind of, as far as I know, that's remained intact. So there are, again, very different stories, different approaches. And from what I've in general been working on over the last, looking at over the last sort of 10 years, really, this really fits what I can see as being a very ad hoc approach to fascist material culture after the war. I think it just kind of depends on the locality at the time, what the local leaders thought. There's no sort of national decision being taken about what to do with this. It's just kind of dealt with at a very local, even individual, personal level on an ad hoc basis.
But are those two sites, the ones in Rome and Bologna, affiliated with churches, or are they?
They're in the main cemetery. So
Okay.
The one in Rome is in the middle of Verano, and the one in Bologna is in Certaldo. So they're just in the middle of the cemeteries.
Okay, so it's 5 minutes past 5. Should we get perhaps a last question? Should we finish here, Silvia? What do you suggest? Let's see if there is at least another question.
If there is another question, I don't know, or Guido, did you have more?
Oh, I do actually.
Yeah. I mean, maybe one more if Simon has time.
I'm fine. It's up to you.
Yeah. But so yeah, since we don't want them to keep Simon for too long, I was waiting to see if someone else wanted to get involved. I'm happy to ask the question. So there is something in the chat. Oh, yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Question. Yes. And Kay, would you like to come on screen or to use the chat? Please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to start video and then to click. My question was a little bit more general. First, thank you so much for this talk. It was very interesting. I'm fascinated by this period, so any time I get to hear things about it and learn more is great. My question was a bit more general in the sense of like how you make sense of this period, which was something I struggled with writing my MA thesis when I'm reading sources. And even if you're sticking to just the politics, you'll read one book and it gives you one perspective, and then you read another and it takes almost a completely different view, and it gets kind of difficult to muddle through that. So I was wondering if you had strategies that you use or like ways that you kind of learn how to manage all of those different perspectives to get at the questions you want to answer.
That's a difficult question. I didn't have time for difficult questions. I only had time for easy questions. I'll be honest, I don't have strategies, no. It's one of the great kind of, I don't know whether it's perhaps one of the good things about my work and perhaps one of the weaknesses of my work. Methodologies are not really my strong point. I didn't grow up sort of being taught methodology. So I work, I work obviously a lot trying to contextualize work within a period. So again, so what I've done on this occasion with this book is I tried to take as many perspectives as I can find. So, and they're obviously very limited. So there are some socialist reports at the time, but there's relatively little because one, they're not particularly interested in talking about this case, and two, they're more interested in talking about their own martyrs, like Spartaco Lavagnini. But you can, I've looked at what they've tried to say. I tried to take the state the state position. So there is a trial for Berta's murder. There is a retrial and a retrial of the retrial, and it's extraordinarily complex. It's beyond my capabilities to deal with, because it's a massive material. A lot of it is kind of indecipherable anyway, because it's kind of handwritten. But we can, manage to piece together the bases of what happens to the trial and the outcomes of the trial and some of the debates within the trial. So you can take this kind of state opinion there. Looking at the local council, the structure of Florence at the time. What's very interesting about this case is that in March 1921, so he dies at the end of February in 21, and by March 9 following month, the local council has already ratified the ad hoc renaming of the Piazza Liquore, which becomes Piazza Giovanni Berta. And there is a council sort of campaign to they want to rename the bridge where he's fallen, that's the original plan, is to rename the bridge Ponte Giovanni Berta. So 18 months before fascism comes to power, the Florentine Council is already very supportive of commemorating an apparent fascist martyr. So I don't know how well that answers the question, but I mean, I do try and take as many perspectives as possible. It's obviously, it's very, very difficult. And there will be, I think there will be a lot of, there's a lot of debate about, the history as it's written says that Berta is a fascist, he's a martyr. I can't prove that he isn't a fascist, but equally I can't prove that he is. So I think I can work with what I got. And until I can find anything else, there's not much else I can really do about it. But it is very complex. But I think the key thing in everything that I've done on this period is always thinking about the bulk of the sources that we got are fascist sources, and we have to remember one, that they're fascist sources, but then all sources kind of have they're all partial. My court, the court sources, we got ideas from statements from lawyers. There's partiality to all of that, so we can only piece that together as best we can as historians and kind of state our position and support it as best we can. If somebody can come along and prove otherwise, then great.
Yes, thanks for this. And perhaps very briefly, I mean, I would like to ask you something specific. I mean, on what you explained about the real, let's say, the real history. Let's try to understand what really happened about Berta. And so you said that if we look at the myth of the propaganda, as you said now, we cannot be sure that he was a fascist. Maybe he was sympathetic, was a supporter. For sure, he was not a member affiliated to the party. You explained you found proof, clear evidence of the fact of the myth of this act of violence in which the communists were supposed to have cut his hands. And then you said, well, we have the autopsy, and so we can tell that this is not the case. But then you even mentioned that perhaps you're not even sure that it was murdered for political reason. Did I understand it right?
Yeah.
To develop on this point, yes.
I think, again, it's something that perhaps I should be. Yeah, perhaps I need to rethink about how I say that. I phrase that, but I guess the point that I'm saying is that Florence is in this moment of kind of civil war. Okay, so there's the attack on the patriotic parade. We've had increasing violence, which kind of erupts in this period. There's a week of quite extreme violence in Florence. It begins with this attack on the patriotic parade, this very brutal assassination of the reprisal attack upon Spartaco Lavagnini. The day after, there is an assault by fascists who, with the support of state troops, so with the support of the police and the military, who attack the area of San Frediano, this working class district. The people of San Frediano barricade themselves in, and they fight back. So there is essentially a war going on in this district, and that's the circumstances with which Berta crosses the bridge. So again, if we read reports again in some of the court reports, some of the eyewitness reports, which are, I think are really, I'm not sure I'm not saying they're not true, but I just don't know the extent to which we can rely upon them. There are some reports that say, oh, they heard someone say, oh, give it to him, he's a fascist, that day, just kill the fascist. there is rumors that he's wearing a fascist badge on his jacket. Again, when he's fished from the river, this is it's a badge of the Red Cross. He's said to be carrying a gun, so he's got a holster. The gun is missing. The key piece of evidence is that he's riding a bike. The bike gets found, or the bicycle pump gets found in the home of the mother of a guy called Busoni, who's home on leave from the military. And this is the key piece of evidence. And Busoni says that this was a plant. He alleges that the police have been to his house and planted this. The case is, it's awfully confusing, but it's really not very convincing. What the stories are, the two kind of, well, the main ideas of what's Berta doing crossing this bridge, because there is a riot going on at best in the city, if not a civil war. What on earth has he done coming from Le Cure, which is probably, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 kilometers away, to the Ponte Sospeso, and he's crossing the river, going into the heart of where it's happening, where there has been bombs, shooting, violence all day. So what's he doing going there? The fascist story says that he's trying to reach his comrades. Okay, so this is a heroic attempt to meet his fascist comrades on the other side of the city. He does wait until he's clocked off at work at about 5 p.m. in the evening. There's some inspector who's investigating an industrial accident in the factory. So he has to wait until the factory's sort of done. Once he's done his job, he gets on his bike and he cycles across the city. He's wearing a suit, so he doesn't look like a member of the working class from the San Frediano district. The alternative theory, and again, I have no real idea on what's true or not, is that he's actually trying to get across the river to go to the Pignone iron factory, which is on the other side of the river, because the two families who have both Berta's family, which has the iron foundry as well, they know each other. So the idea is that he's going over there to try and understand what the situation is and how they are trying to deal with what is there's been a general strike called as well. So it may well be that he's crossing the bridge to go to the Pignone iron factory. There's a riot going on. It's quite likely that people will be guarding the bridge. It's a strategic point within the city. So it's quite likely if you see somebody coming across in a kind of petit bourgeois wearing a suit, someone clearly not identifiably from the working class of San Frediano, you're going to want to know who he is. You might want to stop him crossing the bridge. You might then go and attack him. So my point is that yes, it might be an act of political violence. Well, I think it certainly is an act of political violence. No, for me, but it's an act of political violence within the context of what's happening in the city at the time. Not necessarily because they know that he's a fascist and they go and attack him as a fascist. It may just be that tensions are so heightened that they attack this guy and we don't really know, or someone says, oh, he looks like a fascist, so they beat him up. So that's kind of what I'm saying. But that doesn't, if that's the story, then it really doesn't work for the fascist martyrology. It just doesn't work. If he's had this really unfortunate death, it really just doesn't work. So it's within their interest to constantly stay and build up this story.
Yes, thanks a lot for developing this point. I think it's much clearer, and for your explanation is also quite compelling. I mean, I would agree with this overall take. Okay, so I think I can at least stop the recording, and I would just ask everyone to join me in thanking a lot Simon for this excellent, very interesting presentation. So we'll just stop the recording here.